Hey guys, tonight we're not chasing dragons or storming castles. Instead, we're slipping back into an era where love, as you know it, was a quaint, often inconvenient concept. Imagine, if you will, the flickering candlelight of a smoky, drafty hall, the scent of stale ale and damp straw clinging to the air. You're sitting there, hunched over parchment, trying to decipher a family tree that looks more like a tangled root system than anything resembling human lineage. Your quill scratches, your eyes ache, and somewhere in the background, a lute player is hitting a note so flat it could pave a road. This isn't the grand romance of troubadours. This is the gritty, often exasperating reality of being a medieval matchmaker. You're not Cupid with a quiver. You're more like a medieval HR manager, desperately trying to fill a very specific, often undesirable vacancy. And trust me, you probably won't survive this job with your sanity, let alone your life, fully intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, drop a comment below with your location and current time. It's always wild to see where everyone is tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You see, your job isn't about finding soulmates. It's about finding suitable mates. And suitable, in the Middle Ages, is a term as pliable as freshly baked bread, yet as unyielding as cold iron. You might picture a dashing knight and a fair maiden, but the reality is far less poetic. Your clients aren't seeking emotional connection. They're seeking land, power, alliances, or simply a way to stop their lineage from sputtering out like a damp candlewick. You're a human algorithm, sifting through a frankly terrifying database of feudal obligations, hereditary diseases, though they don't call them that, just bad humors and deeply entrenched rivalries. The pressure is immense. Fail to arrange an advantageous match for a powerful lord, and you might find your services, or perhaps even your head, are no longer required. It's a job where success is quietly expected and failure is loudly, often violently, punished. One of the mainstream historical facts that will haunt your every waking moment is the sheer dynastic imperative. For the nobility, marriage was the ultimate political chess move. It wasn't about love, not really, but about securing borders, cementing truces, or absorbing territories. You're not just pairing two people. You're merging two households, two estates, sometimes even two warring factions. Imagine the delicate balance you have to maintain, knowing that one wrong suggestion could ignite a fresh feud, leading to bloodshed and economic ruin. You're constantly juggling familial pride, territorial ambitions, and the ever-present threat of a rival family swooping in with a better offer, or worse, an army. And here's a quirky tidbit to keep you awake. Some medieval noble families were so obsessed with maintaining specific bloodlines that they'd engage in remarkably close-kin marriages, sometimes requiring papal dispensations to bypass the church's strict rules against consanguinity. You'd be the one navigating those tricky waters, sending petitions, pulling strings, all to unite cousins who probably shared a great-great-grandparent. It's like a twisted family reunion, but with significantly higher stakes and much more uncomfortable conversations about shared grandmothers. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of certain genetic conditions among medieval royalty was purely coincidental or a direct result of these incestuous marital strategies. You, as the matchmaker, just know it adds another layer of complexity to your already impossible task. Yes, my lord, your nephew is strong and true, but also, his jaw seems to be getting wider. You're perpetually exhausted. The roads are terrible, communication is glacially slow, and the people you deal with are, shall we say, unrefined. Diplomacy is key, but so is a thick skin. You learn to read between the lines of flowery letters, to interpret the subtle threats hidden in a lord's polite invitation, and to spot the desperation behind a dowager's haughty demeanor. Every potential union is a gamble, a roll of the dice in a game where the stakes are entire fortunes, generations of lineage, and sometimes the very peace of the realm. You truly earn your meager coin, pushing boundaries, enduring endless travel, and navigating the treacherous currents of medieval society, all for a union that might last a year or a lifetime, or end abruptly with a bout of the sweating sickness. Your client base is, to put it mildly, a mixed bag of medieval anxieties and entitlement. You spend a disproportionate amount of time dealing with the nobility, and let me tell you, their demands are enough to make you wish you'd taken up monastic life instead. They approach you with a laundry list of requirements for a potential spouse, often contradictory, almost always unreasonable, and frequently changing with the political winds. Lord Reginald, for instance, a man whose breath could wilt a flower, insists his daughter must marry a knight of impeccable martial skill, yet also be gentle enough to read poetry by candlelight. Oh, and he absolutely must come with at least 3 profitable villages. You nod, feign enthusiasm, and make a mental note that such a paragon likely only exists in the ballads his bard sings. You see, for these lords and ladies, marriage isn't just a union. It's a strategic acquisition. They want wealth, naturally, but also military strength, political influence, and most importantly, an unquestionable lineage. The thought of their precious family line being tainted by a commoner, or worse, someone with a questionable ancestry, sends shivers down their spines. You're expected to not only find someone who fits their fantastical criteria, but also to verify every rumor, every whisper about a potential suitor's family history. Did their great-aunt truly steal a pig? Was their grandfather secretly a baker? These are the high-stakes questions that keep you up at night, because even the most minor blemish on a family tree can scupper a lucrative match. One mainstream historical fact that you constantly battle is the concept of primogeniture, where the eldest son inherits everything. This means younger sons of noble families are often left with little land or wealth, making them eager, sometimes desperate, candidates for advantageous marriages. They become your problem children, these landless, often restless, younger brothers. They might be skilled fighters or charming poets, but without land, they're a hard sell. You find yourself trying to spin their lack of inherited burdens into a positive, painting them as free spirits unencumbered by the demands of managing a vast estate. It rarely works. He brings only his sword and his wit, you might exclaim. The Lord usually just raises an eyebrow and points to his own sword, already quite sharp, and his own wit, which is primarily focused on acquiring more land. And for a quirky tidbit, imagine having to assess the physical appearance of potential matches, often based on secondhand accounts or highly flattering, almost certainly inaccurate portraits. You might receive a letter describing a lady as having eyes like the summer sky and hair like spun gold, only to arrive and find a woman whose eyes are, in fact, a rather murky gray, and whose hair resembles a tangled bird's nest. You then have the unenviable task of gently, delicately, managing your client's expectations without openly insulting their prospective in-laws. Ah, yes, you might murmur. The artist clearly captured her inner beauty with remarkable fidelity. Historians still argue whether medieval portraiture was intentionally deceptive or simply limited by the artistic conventions and materials of the time. You, however, are just trying to avoid being yelled at for misrepresenting the merchandise. Then there are the personal quirks of your clients themselves. One lord might insist on a bride who can spin wool finer than any other, while another demands a groom who can compose a ballad on demand. You nod, you smile, you inwardly groan. These are the whims you must cater to, the arbitrary tests you must devise. You find yourself becoming an amateur genealogist, a part-time detective, and a full-time therapist for the emotionally stunted elite. You might even have to politely explain why marrying a known bandit leader, despite his significant wealth, might not be the most stable long-term strategy for their daughter's happiness, or indeed, her survival. The stress of managing these high-strung individuals who hold your livelihood and sometimes your life in their hands is a constant weight. You learn to speak in riddles, to offer just enough information to satisfy without committing yourself to absolute truth. Because in this world, absolute truth is often a luxury you cannot afford. While the nobles are busy demanding spouses who are simultaneously powerful, rich, beautiful, and able to juggle flaming swords, you occasionally get a glimpse into the far more pragmatic world of the peasantry. And let me tell you, it's a stark contrast. Here, love isn't even a whisper. It's a distant, almost alien concept. Their unions are dictated by survival, by the brutal realities of the land, and the unrelenting grip of poverty. You wouldn't typically act as a matchmaker for peasants, as their arrangements were usually local and far less formal. But you'd certainly encounter their lives and their motivations, which serve as a constant, sobering counterpoint to the absurdities of the aristocracy. Imagine you're trudging through a muddy village lane, your boots sinking with every step, the smell of wood smoke and animal dung thick in the air. You see a young man, barely more than a boy, struggling to clear a rocky field. His back is bent, his hands are calloused, and his face is already etched with the hardships of a life tied to the soil. He needs a wife, not for romance, but for an extra pair of hands in the fields, for someone to tend the hearth, to bear children who will, in turn, become more hands for the never-ending labor. His prospective bride, likely from the next hovel over, isn't judged on her wit or her charm, but on her strength, her health, and her ability to work from dawn till dusk. Does she look strong enough to haul water? Can she mend clothes and manage a small garden? These are the real questions. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this reality is the concept of the family as an economic unit. For peasants, every member had to contribute to the survival of the household. A marriage wasn't just joining two people. It was merging two sets of labor, two meager resources, to increase the chances of not starving during the next harsh winter. Children were seen as future labor, an investment in the continuation of the family farm or craft. This brutal practicality meant that choices were limited and personal preference was a luxury no one could afford. You'd observe these arrangements and feel a strange mix of relief at their straightforwardness and despair at their lack of tenderness. No elaborate dowries, no convoluted genealogies, just raw, undeniable need. And here's a quirky tidbit. Sometimes, if a peasant couple was too closely related for the church's liking, but absolutely needed to marry for economic survival, perhaps they were the last two members of a tiny hamlet or held adjacent, interdependent strips of land, they might simply not tell the priest the full truth. The church's rules on consanguinity, while strict, were often difficult to enforce in isolated rural communities, leading to a kind of localized, quiet circumvention. You might hear whispers of such unions, knowing that while the noble families hired you to bend rules officially, the peasants just bent them out of necessity. Historians still argue whether such instances were widespread acts of defiance or simply pragmatic adaptations to harsh conditions. For you, it's just another example of how deeply entrenched social norms could be quietly sidestepped when survival was on the line. The motivations were entirely different. While your noble clients were chasing prestige and power, the common folk were chasing subsistence. A good harvest, healthy livestock, and enough children to help with the chores, these were the dreams of the peasantry. Their concept of a good match revolved around practical skills and mutual utility. If a woman could spin a decent thread and cook a passable stew, she was a catch. If a man could plow a straight furrow and mend a leaky roof, he was a desirable husband. You, in your more formal role, rarely brokered these unions directly, but you'd witness them, a stark reminder of the fundamental human needs that underpinned all of society, from the highest lord to the lowest serf. It made the nobles' petty squabbles over titles and trinkets seem even more absurd, a distant, muffled echo from a world of unimaginable comfort, far removed from the dirt and toil that truly sustained a realm. As a medieval matchmaker, you don't just contend with the whims of lords and the realities of peasants. You are constantly entangled in the dense, often illogical, and always unforgiving web of religious rules and restrictions. The church, in its infinite wisdom, had an opinion on everything, and marriage was definitely top of its list. It wasn't just about finding two available people. It was about ensuring their union didn't violate a labyrinthine set of decrees that seemed designed more to trip you up than to guide true love. Imagine trying to arrange a marriage, only to find out the prospective bride is the goddaughter of the groom's second cousin, twice removed. Sounds simple, right? Wrong. The church's rules on consanguinity, blood relation, and affinity, relation by marriage or spiritual ties, like godparents, were astonishingly broad. You couldn't just marry your actual cousin. You often couldn't marry someone who was related to you by marriage, or even someone who was related to your godparent. This meant families had to keep incredibly detailed, often oral, histories of their extended kin, and you, the poor matchmaker, had to be a walking encyclopedia of obscure familial connections. It's like trying to play a game of Twister while blindfolded, and the penalty for touching the wrong color isn't just falling over, but eternal damnation. One mainstream historical fact that makes your life a living purgatory is the concept of spiritual kinship. If you were a godparent to someone's child, you became spiritually related to that child and their parents, creating a barrier to marriage. This meant a lord couldn't marry the sister of a man whose child he'd sponsored at baptism. You'd arrive at a negotiation, parchment in hand, ready to seal a deal, only for some zealous cleric to pipe up with, "Ah, but my lord, did you not stand as godfather to Lady Eleanor's niece back in 78? And just like that, weeks of negotiation, perilous travel, and painstaking research go up in smoke. You learn to dread baptismal records more than battlefield reports. And here's a quirky tidbit that would truly test your patience. The church even had rules about what times of year you could marry. Advent and Lent, for example, were generally forbidden periods for weddings, being times of penance and reflection. So, if you had a hot prospect who was available, willing, and miraculously not related to anyone within 5 generations, you still might have to wait months for the permissible wedding season. Imagine explaining this to a hot-headed young knight eager to secure his bride and her dowry. "Yes, my lord, she is perfect, but the stars, or rather, the Pope, dictate we must wait until after Easter. Perhaps you could practice your jousting in the meantime." Historians still argue whether these restrictions were primarily for theological reasons or if they also served a practical purpose, perhaps allowing time for agricultural cycles or simply maintaining social order. You, however, are just grateful for any excuse to stall for more time, or perhaps escape a bad match gracefully. The concept of pre-contract was another nightmare. A simple exchange of vows between a man and a woman, even without witnesses, could be considered a binding marriage in the eyes of the church. This meant that if a young lord, perhaps after a few too many flagons of mead, whispered sweet nothings and a promise of marriage to a serving girl that could, technically, be considered a valid union, ruining any grander plans you had for him. You'd constantly hear whispers of such informal agreements, trying to ascertain their validity, which often meant interviewing drunkards and unreliable servants. It was like a medieval version of reality TV, but with much graver consequences. You often found yourself trying to discreetly undo such unions, a task as delicate and dangerous as defusing a bomb. The moral tightrope you walked, balancing the letter of church law with the practicalities of powerful families, was incredibly thin, and one slip could mean ruin. Beyond the infuriating labyrinth of religious rules, you, the medieval matchmaker, face an enemy far more insidious and unpredictable: health hazards and disease risks. In an era before even basic understanding of hygiene, let alone modern medicine, a promising match could be scuppered or even tragically ended by an unseen enemy. You were essentially gambling with people's lives and lineages, hoping that your meticulously arranged union wouldn't be cut short by the pervasive illnesses of the age. Imagine you've just spent months, perhaps even a year, negotiating a truly advantageous marriage for a powerful lord's only daughter. The dowry is agreed upon, the political alliances are solidified, and the wedding date is set. Then, a whisper reaches your ear. The groom, a strapping young knight, has come down with a sudden fever. You rush to investigate, your stomach churning, only to find him sweating profusely delirious, his skin covered in angry red spots. It's the measles, or perhaps the dreaded sweating sickness, a common affliction that could sweep through a household with terrifying speed. Suddenly, all your hard work, all your careful planning, dissolves into thin air as you watch the potential groom fight for his life, or more likely, lose it. It's like building a magnificent sandcastle, only for the tide to casually, mercilessly wash it away. One mainstream historical fact that made your job an absolute nightmare was the sheer high mortality rate, particularly among children and young adults. Diseases like smallpox, dysentery, and the various fevers were endemic. A family might have 5 children, only for 2 or 3 to survive to adulthood. This meant that finding a bride or groom who was not only available, but also healthy enough to produce heirs was a constant, nerve-wracking challenge. You couldn't just check for a pulse. You had to try and discern subtle signs of lingering illness, a cough that seemed too persistent, a paleness that spoke of deeper issues. You develop a morbid expertise in assessing vitality, an uncomfortable skill for a professional matchmaker. And here's a quirky tidbit you'd come across. A kind of medieval folk medicine meets desperate pragmatism. Some families would try bizarre remedies to boost the health of a prospective bride or groom before a viewing, hoping to mask underlying conditions. You might hear tales of children being bathed in concoctions of herbs and animal entrails, or fed strange elixirs to give them a temporary flush of health. While largely ineffective, these practices highlight the desperation people felt to secure a good match and safeguard their lineage. You'd stand there, perhaps smelling something vaguely herbal and suspiciously pungent, try to deduce if that vibrant glow was natural health or just a very aggressive poultice. Historians still argue about the true efficacy of many medieval remedies, but for you, it was just another layer of uncertainty to navigate. The psychological toll on you, the matchmaker, was immense. You knew that even if a match was successfully made, the newlyweds faced an uncertain future. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous for women, and infant mortality was tragically common. You were essentially arranging a union that might produce healthy heirs, or might result in the death of the bride, the child, or both. You'd learn to temper your expectations, to never celebrate too soon, because in the medieval world, death was a constant companion, hovering just outside the door, ready to snatch away the most promising futures. You were selling hope, but you knew, deep down, that you couldn't guarantee longevity, a grim truth that weighed heavily on your conscience as you moved from one fragile negotiation to the next. If navigating religious rules and dodging plague was a nightmare, then let's talk about the dowries, the financial minefield that could blow up even the most carefully constructed match. This wasn't just a simple gift from the bride's family. It was a complex, often hotly contested, exchange of wealth that could make or break a family's future, and certainly make or break your commission. You weren't just a matchmaker. You were a medieval financial advisor, negotiator, and often a human shield against the fury of aggrieved parents. Imagine a lord, stingy as a winter's night, trying to marry off his daughter. He wants a powerful son-in-law, naturally, but he also wants to give away as little as possible. On the other side, you have the groom's family, eyeing every last coin, every acre of land, every piece of silver plate, as if their very survival depended on it. You, the matchmaker, are trapped in the middle, trying to bridge a chasm of greed and expectation. Every piece of property, every head of livestock, every silken gown became a point of brutal negotiation. It was like a game of medieval poker, but instead of chips, you were dealing with entire estates. One mainstream historical fact that made this process excruciatingly slow and contentious was that the dowry often represented a significant portion of a family's wealth. For a noble family, it might include land, castles, rights to tolls, or vast sums of money. For a less affluent family, it could be livestock, household goods, or even skilled labor. This wasn't pocket change. It was a family's legacy, their security, being transferred. So, when a negotiation stalled over, say, the number of cows, or the exact boundaries of small forest. It wasn't petty squabbling. It was a desperate fight for economic survival. You'd find yourself painstakingly listing every single item, from feather beds to silver spoons, trying to ensure everything was accounted for and that no one felt cheated. And here's a quirky tidbit that adds another layer of stress. The dowry was often paid in installments. This meant that even after the wedding, your headaches weren't over. You might be called upon to mediate disputes if the second or third installment of the dowry was late, or if a promised parcel of land turned out to be less fertile than advertised. Imagine the scene: a furious father-in-law banging on the groom's gate, demanding his due, and you, the poor matchmaker, being dragged back into the fray to remind everyone of the original, intricate agreement. It was a lingering threat, a sword of Damocles hanging over the new union for years. Historians still argue about the exact legal enforceability of these installment plans, but for you, it meant endless postnuptial drama. The concept of the morning gift Morgan gave was a slight counterbalance, but it often complicated matters further. This was a gift from the groom to the bride on the morning after their wedding, essentially her personal property that would provide for her if she was widowed. While seemingly generous, it was also part of the overall financial calculation. The size of the morning gift could affect the size of the dowry, leading to even more complex back and forths. You were essentially calculating a medieval balance sheet, trying to ensure that both sides felt they were getting a fair, or at least acceptable, deal. The tension in these negotiations was palpable, often more intense than any discussion of personality or compatibility. After all, love was fleeting, but land and silver were forever. Or at least until the next war or plague or a particularly hungry dragon. As if navigating the treacherous shoals of dowries and disease wasn't enough, your life as a medieval matchmaker is perpetually overshadowed by the grand, brutal game of political alliances and betrayals. Marriages in the nobility weren't just personal unions. They were the very fabric of power, the threads that wove kingdoms together or ripped them apart. You weren't simply pairing a lord with a lady. You were drawing up treaties, preventing wars, or, inadvertently, sowing the seeds for future conflicts. It was less about romance and more about realpolitik with a side of really bad fashion. Imagine a situation where two powerful families, long-standing rivals, have finally agreed to a marriage pact as a way to end generations of bloodshed. You've spent months, perhaps years, acting as the intermediary, risking your neck traveling through disputed territories, smoothing ruffled feathers, and translating cryptic messages. The wedding is imminent, peace is within reach, and then bam. A messenger arrives, breathless, with news that one of the families is secretly allied with a third, even more powerful house, effectively rendering your carefully constructed peace treaty null and void. The betrayal stings, not just professionally, but personally, as you know your life might now be in danger from the slighted party. It's like being a chess master, only for your opponent to suddenly declare that pawns can fly and castles can teleport. One mainstream historical fact that you constantly grappled with was the ever-shifting loyalties of feudal lords. Alliances were rarely permanent. They were strategic and opportunistic. A marriage could bind two families today, but if a better opportunity arose tomorrow, a chance to gain more land, a richer bride, or a stronger military ally, that bond could be severed, often violently. You had to have an encyclopedic knowledge of regional politics, knowing which lords were feuding, which were amenable to reconciliation, and which were simply waiting for the opportune moment to backstab their supposed allies. Your political intelligence had to be as sharp as any spy master's. And here's a quirky tidbit that demonstrates the fluidity of these alliances. There are documented cases where marriages were arranged purely as a temporary truce, with both sides fully expecting to break the alliance and perhaps even annul the marriage once a more favorable opportunity presented itself. Imagine a lord agreeing to his daughter's marriage to a rival's son, all while secretly planning to betray him in 2 years and marry her to someone else. You, the matchmaker, might be privy to these cynical maneuvers, forced to play along, knowing that your success was built on a foundation of shifting sand. Historians still argue about the moral implications of these strategic marriages, but for you, it was just another day at the office, where trust was a luxury and cynicism a necessity. The consequences of a failed political marriage were catastrophic. It wasn't just a divorce. It could mean outright war, the loss of land, the imprisonment or execution of hostages, often children sent as part of the initial peace agreement, and the complete ruin of a family. You carried the weight of knowing that your advice, your negotiations, could directly lead to immense suffering. You had to constantly weigh the risks, to assess the true intentions behind the polite smiles and lavish feasts. Was this a genuine desire for peace, or just a tactical pause before the next round of hostilities? You learned to read the subtle cues, the fleeting expressions, the tone of a letter, because your professional survival depended on your ability to predict the unpredictable, to anticipate the next betrayal before it erupted into full-blown conflict. It was a job for the truly paranoid, which, as it turns out, was a good thing to be in the Middle Ages. As if the external pressures of politics, plague, and pecuniary squabbles weren't enough, you, the tireless medieval matchmaker, must also contend with the rigid constraints of gender roles and limited choices. This isn't a story of romantic liberation. It's a stark portrayal of a society where a woman's worth was often tied to her ability to produce heirs and secure alliances, and a man's to his land and lineage. For you, this meant an agonizingly narrow set of options and constant frustration. Imagine trying to marry off a spirited, intelligent young noblewoman who dreams of reading ancient texts and debating philosophy. Her father, however, sees her only as a vessel for his family's future, a pawn in his strategic games. You're tasked with finding her a husband who is suitable, meaning powerful, and rich regardless of whether he possesses an ounce of intellectual curiosity or even basic human kindness. Your attempts to suggest a match based on shared interests or potential companionship are met with blank stares or polite dismissal. What matters, the father might declare, is his estate, not his ability to discuss the intricacies of Aquinas. You learn quickly that personality is a luxury no one can afford, especially not a woman. One mainstream historical fact that completely dictates your approach is that women were primarily viewed as instruments of dynastic continuity. Their value in the marriage market largely stemmed from their reproductive potential and their ability to bring a dowry. A woman's beauty was a bonus, her intellect largely irrelevant, and her personal desires completely ignored. Your job often felt like trading livestock, albeit livestock that could speak and occasionally weep. You'd constantly have to remind yourself of this brutal reality, even as you sympathized with the young women whose fates you were orchestrating. And here's a quirky tidbit that highlights the stark power imbalance. If a noblewoman was considered too old for childbearing, or if she was widowed and childless, her value on the marriage market plummeted dramatically, often regardless of her wealth or status. You might find yourself scrambling to find a second husband for a childless dowager, a task that felt like trying to sell last season's fashion to a notoriously fickle court. Conversely, a young, fertile bride, even from a lesser family, might be snapped up by a powerful lord eager to secure his line. Historians still argue whether medieval women held more informal power within the household than previously acknowledged, but from your perspective, their formal choices in marriage were almost non-existent. For men, while they certainly had more agency, their choices were also limited by social standing and economic necessity. A younger son of a noble family, for example, might be forced into a clerical career or a marriage with a wealthy, but otherwise undesirable, older widow simply to secure his financial future. You'd witness these arranged inconveniences and the quiet desperation in their eyes. A man couldn't simply marry a peasant girl, no matter how lovely or strong, without severely damaging his family's reputation and potentially disinheriting himself. So, while a lord had more choice than a lady, his freedom was still tightly bound by the expectations of his class and the needs of his lineage. You were not facilitating unions of passion, but of calculation, a cold, hard assessment of what each party could bring to the table, rather than what they could share. It's a relentless grind, and any fleeting glimpse of genuine affection between your clients is a rare, almost shocking, anomaly in a world built on strategic utility. As if the societal and familial pressures weren't enough, your role as a medieval matchmaker is fundamentally a peripatetic one, meaning you're almost constantly on the move. This isn't a job you do from a comfortable office. It's a life lived on the road, beset by all the perils and discomforts of travel troubles and perilous journeys. Every negotiation, every assessment of a potential spouse requires you to physically transport yourself across vast, often dangerous distances. Imagine setting out on a journey from a bustling market town, heading towards a remote castle nestled deep in the untamed wilderness. Your transport is likely a sturdy but bone-jarring cart, or perhaps a reliable but equally uncomfortable horse. The roads, if they can even be called that, are little more than muddy tracks, deeply rutted and prone to turning into impassable quagmires after a rain. Bridges are rickety, fords are treacherous, and the sheer slowness of it all is enough to test the patience of a saint. A journey that today might take a few hours by car could easily consume weeks or even months of your life, each mile fraught with potential disaster. One mainstream historical fact that makes these journeys truly harrowing is the prevalence of bandits and highwaymen. The medieval countryside was not a safe place. Disbanded soldiers, desperate peasants, or opportunistic criminals lurked in forests and along lonely stretches of road, eager to relieve travelers of their valuables. As a matchmaker, you would likely carry important documents, perhaps even small sums of money for expenses, making you a tempting target. You'd travel armed, of course, or with a small retinue of guards. But even then, safety was never guaranteed. Every shadow could conceal a threat. Every rustle in the bushes could signal an ambush. You learn to sleep with one eye open and your hand near your dagger. And here's a quirky tidbit you'd learn to appreciate, or at least tolerate. The quality of medieval inns was, to put it mildly, inconsistent. You might find yourself sharing a room, or even just a straw pallet, with strangers, livestock, and a symphony of snores and various unpleasant bodily noises. Food would be whatever was available, often bland and occasionally suspect. Imagine trying to get a good night's rest before a crucial negotiation, while a pig snuffles contentedly at the foot of your bed, and the local drunkard serenades the moon with off-key ballads. Historians still argue about the true conditions of average medieval inns. Were they truly as bad as depicted in some contemporary accounts, or were there hidden gems? For you, the answer was always a roll of the dice, and often not in your favor. The sheer logistical nightmare of these journeys was a constant drain on your resources and sanity. You had to plan your routes meticulously, considering not just distance, but also the availability of safe lodging, fresh water, and fodder for your animals. You relied on word of mouth for directions, which, as you can imagine, was about as reliable as a broken sundial. Weather was a constant. Unpredictable anemia, sudden blizzard could trap you for days. A torrential rain could swell rivers and make roads impassable. You learned to be self-sufficient, to repair your own cart, to navigate by the stars, and to cultivate an iron bladder. Every successful match you orchestrated felt less like a triumph of negotiation and more like a miracle of sheer endurance against the elements and the constant threat of being waylaid, robbed, or simply lost in the vast, unforgiving landscape. Perhaps the most frustrating and utterly soul-crushing aspect of being a medieval matchmaker wasn't the travel or the terrible hygiene, but the sheer, mind-numbing lack of reliable information. You were operating in a pre-internet, pre-telegraph, pre-everything digital world. Information flowed at the pace of a limping donkey, was often distorted by rumor, prejudice, and outright fabrication, and was almost impossible to verify independently. It was like trying to complete a jigsaw puzzle where half the pieces were missing and the other half were from a different puzzle entirely. Imagine receiving a letter from a distant lord, written by a scribe with questionable literacy, describing his daughter. The description is, of course, utterly glowing, of fair complexion, virtuous spirit, and nimble wit. You have no photographs, no video calls, no background checks. You rely entirely on the word of a man whose primary goal is to marry off his daughter to the most advantageous suitor possible, and who therefore has every incentive to exaggerate her virtues and omit her flaws. You might later discover that her fair complexion is a euphemism for a face scarred by smallpox, and her nimble wit translates to an alarming tendency to argue with inanimate objects. You're constantly selling a pig in a poke, hoping the buyer won't notice the pig's missing eye until after the transaction is complete. One mainstream historical fact that made this particularly challenging was the reliance on heraldry and family reputation, which could be easily manipulated or misunderstood. While heraldic rolls could confirm lineage, they didn't tell you if the family was secretly bankrupt, or if the prospective groom had a violent temper, or if the bride's aunt was known for dabbling in witchcraft. You'd gather intelligence from traveling merchants, returning soldiers, or gossiping pilgrims, but every piece of information came with a significant caveat. Was that merchant just trying to curry favor? Did that soldier have an axe to grind with the family? You were a medieval data analyst, but your data was wildly corrupted and prone to viral misinformation. And here's a quirky tidbit you'd learn to dread. Sometimes, families would deliberately send a decoy relative for initial meetings. This might be a younger, prettier sister in place of the actual, less appealing bride, or a charming, well-spoken uncle standing in for a socially awkward, stammering nephew. The hope was that by the time the truth was revealed, the match was too far along to easily break off. You develop a keen eye for these subtle deceptions, like a medieval detective trying to spot a con artist. Historians still argue about how widespread such practices were, but for you, every first impression was met with a healthy dose of suspicion. The sheer time lag in communication was another source of immense frustration. A letter could take weeks, even months, to reach its destination. A simple yes or no could require half a year of waiting. This meant that by the time you received a response to one query, the circumstances on the ground might have completely changed. The prospective groom might have died, or married someone else, or fallen out of favor with the king. You were always playing catch-up, always trying to make decisions based on outdated information, a medieval forecaster trying to predict the weather using last year's almanac. It made the job a constant exercise in patience, resilience, and the acceptance that, despite your best efforts, you were often flying blind. So, you're armed with unreliable information, battered by travel, and constantly under the specter of disease and political upheaval. But what really grates on your nerves as a medieval matchmaker is dealing with difficult personalities. Forget the grand strategies. Sometimes, the sheer human factor, the petty squabbles, the bizarre quirks, and the outright madness of your clients and their families threaten to push you over the edge. You are, in essence, a medieval psychologist, mediator, and occasional punching bag. Imagine sitting across from a potential father-in-law, a man whose reputation for miserliness precedes him. He scrutinizes every line of the marriage contract, arguing over the precise number of chickens in the dowry, while his equally disagreeable wife complains about the prospective groom's slightly crooked nose. You're trying to secure a significant alliance, and you're stuck debating poultry and nasal symmetry. It's like trying to herd cats while simultaneously explaining astrophysics to a turnip. Your patience, a finite resource, is constantly being chipped away by these relentless, nitpicking, and often profoundly rude individuals. One mainstream historical fact that made this particularly challenging was the absolute power wielded by heads of households, especially fathers. Their word was law, and their whims dictated the fates of their children. This meant you couldn't appeal to reason or logic if a lord simply decided he didn't like the color of the prospective groom's tunic, or if a lady developed a sudden, inexplicable aversion to the bride's family crest. You were dealing with unchecked authority, often fueled by pride, superstition, or simply a bad mood after a particularly heavy dinner. You learn to identify the true decision maker and focus your efforts on them, often enduring slights and insults from lesser family members along the way. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some noble families were known for their truly eccentric habits. You might encounter a lord who refused to conduct any business on a Tuesday, believing it to be an unlucky day, or a lady who consulted her personal astrologer for every major decision, including whom her children should marry. Imagine waiting for weeks, cooling your heels, because the stars weren't aligned for a contract signing, or trying to convince a superstitious mother that the groom's birthmark wasn't a sign of demonic possession. Historians still argue about the true extent to which superstition dictated daily life versus being a convenient excuse for powerful individuals. But for you, it was just another obstacle to navigate in your quest for a sealed marriage pact. Then there's the issue of unruly potential spouses themselves. While most were resigned to their fates, occasionally you'd encounter a defiant daughter who openly rebelled against an unwanted match, or a son who ran off with a stable girl, throwing all your carefully laid plans into chaos. You'd be the one tasked with either bringing the errant party back to heel, a dangerous proposition, or subtly trying to spin the disaster into something palatable for the injured party. Yes, my lord, your daughter has eloped with a commoner, but perhaps this frees her for a truly magnificent union now. It's a delicate dance, always on the edge of outright deception, and always with the knowledge that one misstep could mean losing a client, or worse, making a powerful enemy. You developed an almost supernatural ability to remain outwardly calm, even as your insides churned with frustration and a burning desire to just lock everyone in a room until they agreed. All the difficult personalities, the unreliable information, the perilous journeys, they all fed into one crucial, terrifying vulnerability for you, the medieval matchmaker, the power of reputation and rumor. In a world without widespread media or easy verification, your standing, your very livelihood, hung by a thread woven from whispers and perceptions. A single bad match, a single accusation of incompetence or dishonesty, could unravel your entire career faster than a poorly spun yarn. Imagine you've successfully arranged a marriage between two prominent families. Months later, a rumor starts circulating that the bride, your client, is barren, or that the groom has a secret, disfiguring illness. Regardless of the truth, the whispers spread like wildfire. Suddenly, other potential clients become wary. Why would they trust you with their precious lineage if your last match was, by popular opinion, a disaster? It's like being a medieval influencer, but instead of losing followers, you lose your next meal, or worse, your head. Your entire business model is built on an intangible asset that can be destroyed by a single malicious tongue. One mainstream historical fact that amplified this danger was the oral culture of the Middle Ages. News, both good and bad, traveled by word of mouth, amplified and distorted with each retelling. A simple misunderstanding could morph into a scandalous tale of deception, ruining your good name. You had to be exquisitely careful with every word you spoke, every promise you made, because any perceived failure will be magnified 100-fold through the village gossip network and the aristocratic grapevine. You became a master of subtle language, always leaving yourself a loophole, never making an absolute guarantee, because absolute guarantees were a luxury you could not afford in a world so dependent on hearsay. And here's a quirky tidbit. Some matchmakers, or indeed other medieval professionals relying on reputation, would go to elaborate lengths to protect their image, sometimes even staging elaborate successes or subtly discrediting rivals through planted rumors. You might hear whispers of a rival matchmaker being unlucky or cursed, knowing full well that such stories were strategically circulated to steer clients towards yourself. It was a brutal, no-holds-barred competition. Historians still argue about the precise mechanisms and intentionality behind medieval smear campaigns. But for you, it was a daily reality, a reminder that your professional survival depended on more than just skillet, depended on controlling the narrative. The concept of honor played an enormous role, especially among the nobility. If a marriage you arranged brought perceived dishonor to a family, perhaps the groom was revealed to be a coward, or the bride was less virtuous than promised that dishonor would reflect directly back on you. You could face not just loss of payment, but social ostracism or even physical retribution from the offended party. You had to cultivate a network of reliable informants, people who could give you the real scoop on a family, not just the flattering facade they presented. This meant cultivating spies among servants, befriending minor clerics, and listening intently to the chatter in taverns and market squares. You were constantly gathering intelligence, trying to get ahead of the rumors, to inoculate yourself against the inevitable tides of public opinion that could, at any moment, wash your career away. The pressure to maintain an impeccable, even if manufactured, reputation was immense, a constant performance of competence in a deeply unpredictable world. Just when you thought you had a handle on the political machinations, the dowry disputes, and the insufferable personalities, there's another, ever-present reality that consistently pulled the rug out from under your feet, the ever-present threat of death. In the medieval world, life was fleeting and fragile. Famine, plague, warfare, childbirth, accidents all conspired to make mortality a grim, inescapable fact. For you, the matchmaker, this meant that meticulously arranged plans could unravel in an instant, leaving you with nothing but wasted effort and potentially dangerous recriminations. Imagine you've successfully negotiated a truly advantageous match for a young lord, a union that promises to secure vast lands and a powerful alliance. The ink is barely dry on the contract, and preparations for the wedding are underway. Then, word arrives cold and stark that the prospective bride, a healthy young woman just weeks prior, has succumbed to a sudden, virulent fever. All your work, all your hopes for a substantial commission vanish. You're left with the unenviable task of informing the grieving and likely furious groom's family that their future daughter-in-law is now residing in the local graveyard. It's like trying to build a house of cards in a hurricane. One gust, and everything collapses. One mainstream historical fact that made this a perpetual nightmare was the lack of medical understanding and effective treatments. A simple infection, a broken bone, or a common cold could quickly escalate into a fatal condition. Childbirth was a particularly perilous time for women, with high rates of maternal mortality. This meant that even if you secured a strong, healthy bride, you knew that the union was only as stable as her next pregnancy. You were constantly aware that any match you made could be annulled not by choice, but by the Grim Reaper himself, leaving you to pick up the pieces and start the whole arduous process over again, often for the same distraught, or even deceased client. And here's a quirky tidbit that added another layer of macabre uncertainty: the concept of deathbed marriages. In some desperate cases, if a noble was dying and had no legitimate heir, a quick, often informal, marriage might be arranged on their deathbed to legitimize an illegitimate child or to ensure a specific lineage continued. You might be called upon in such frantic, emotionally charged circumstances, trying to conduct a binding ceremony while the groom was barely clinging to life. It was a bizarre, heartbreaking race against time, a final, desperate attempt to salvage a family line. Historians still argue about the legal validity and frequency of such deathbed unions. But for you, it was just another desperate measure in a desperate age. The constant specter of death also meant that widowhood was incredibly common, and often, remarriage was a necessity for both men and women to secure their economic future or to provide a guardian for orphan children. You would spend a significant amount of your time arranging second, third, or even fourth marriages for individuals who had simply outlived multiple spouses. Each new union brought its own set of complexities, blending families, managing stepchildren, and dealing with the emotional baggage of previous losses. You weren't just finding partners. You were navigating a revolving door of grief, necessity, and a desperate hope for continuity in a world where life was always lived on the precipice. It was a sobering reminder that even the most carefully laid plans could be undone by the simple, brutal reality of human mortality. After all the perilous journeys, the frustrating negotiations, and the constant threat of death, what did you, the medieval matchmaker, actually have to show for it? The truth is, successes were rare, failures were frequent, and the rewards were often meager. This wasn't a profession where every effort bore fruit. It was a grueling test of endurance, where even small victories felt monumental against a backdrop of constant setbacks and thankless toil. Imagine the sheer emotional and physical investment you poured into a single match. Months of travel, countless letters, endless conversations, enduring bad food, worse lodging, and the ever-present threat of bandits or disease. You finally broker a deal, the contracts are signed, the families are, mostly, satisfied, and the wedding bells ring. This moment of triumph is fleeting. You might receive a modest fee, perhaps a new tunic or a few silver coins, but it rarely felt commensurate with the effort expended. And even that success could be quickly forgotten if the marriage proved unhappy, childless, or, worst of all, ended in scandal or death. It's like climbing a treacherous mountain, reaching the summit for a moment of cold, windy glory, only to immediately start planning the next, even more difficult ascent. One mainstream historical fact that underscored the precariousness of your success was the lack of formal contracts or protections for professionals like yourself. You operated largely on reputation and trust, both of which were fragile. If a lord decided he wasn't happy with the match, he might simply refuse to pay your fee, or worse, accuse you of malfeasance. You had little recourse. There were no medieval labor laws, no professional guilds to protect your interests. Your payment was often contingent on the perceived success of the marriage, a subjective measure that could change with the wind. And here's a quirky tidbit you'd come to detest. Some unscrupulous lords would even try to extract information from you about other potential matches they might have overlooked, essentially using your hard-won knowledge without paying for your services. You'd have to learn to be incredibly cagey, revealing just enough to keep interest, but never enough to give away your intellectual property for free. Imagine explaining why a particular family wasn't suitable for their daughter, subtly hinting at hidden flaws, without revealing the actual reasons that you'd spent months uncovering. Historians still debate the ethical codes, or lack thereof, that govern such medieval intermediaries, but for you, it was a constant battle of wits. The sheer volume of failed attempts was demoralizing. For every successful union, you likely had 10 or more that fell through. A potential spouse died, a family alliance shifted, a dowry couldn't be agreed upon, or simply, a stubborn lord changed his mind at the last minute. Each failure represented wasted time, wasted resources, and a renewed search for another unlikely candidate. You learned to cultivate a thick skin, to absorb disappointment, and to constantly restart the arduous process, knowing that the odds were always stacked against you. The reward for your tireless efforts was rarely wealth or recognition, but simply the opportunity to continue your thankless trade, hoping that the next roll of the dice might just land on a winner. You were perpetually caught in a cycle of high stakes and often low returns, making every small triumph feel like a hard-won battle. So you've endured the political machinations, the dowry wars, the deadly diseases, and the endless, perilous journeys. You've navigated the maddening lack of information and the sheer exasperation of dealing with difficult, demanding personalities. What does this all add up to for you, the tireless medieval matchmaker? It adds up to a lonely and exhausting life, a relentless grind that slowly, inexorably grinds down your spirit. Imagine the solitude. You're constantly on the road, away from any semblance of a permanent home or stable companionship. Your friends are the innkeepers and stable boys you encounter fleetingly, the distant whispers of court gossip, and the endless parchment you pore over by the dim light of a sputtering candle. You can't truly confide in your clients for obvious reasons, and your rivals are hardly your confidants. You carry the burdens of their anxieties, their desperate hopes, and their often unrealistic expectations, with no one to truly share the load. It's a nomadic existence, a life spent perpetually in motion, yet deeply isolated, like a lone wolf constantly tracking its next elusive prey. One mainstream historical fact that underscores this isolation is the lack of established professional networks or colleagues in your line of work. While there might have been others performing similar services, you operated largely independently, competing rather than collaborating. There were no annual matchmaker conventions, no support groups for dealing with unreasonable lords. You were a singular entity in a vast, often hostile world, relying solely on your wits, your skills, and your increasingly frayed nerves to survive and succeed. This professional solitude intensified the personal loneliness, making every setback feel doubly heavy. And here's a quirky tidbit you'd probably grow to appreciate. Your most constant companions would be your horse, your travel-worn satchel, and the stars overhead during your lonely watches on the road. You'd learn to find comfort in the rhythm of the road, the subtle shift of the seasons, and the quiet beauty of a night sky far from the flickering torches of human ambition. These small, fleeting moments of connection with the natural world might be the only true solace you find in your taxing life. Historians still argue about the inner lives and emotional resilience of medieval individuals in such demanding roles. But you knew, deep down, that a silent, enduring strength was your most valuable asset. The exhaustion is relentless. The physical toll of constant travel, often in harsh weather, combined with the mental strain of intricate negotiations and constant vigilance, leaves you perpetually weary. You're always on, always calculating, always assessing, always guarding your tongue and your reputation. There's no true rest, no deep relaxation, because the next challenge, the next demanding client, the next political upheaval is always just around the corner. Your dreams are likely filled with endless family trees, unreadable contracts, and the faces of hopeful, desperate, or simply tyrannical parents. You might occasionally wonder if any of the couples you've brought together ever find a moment of genuine happiness, a true connection, but such thoughts are quickly suppressed by the pressing realities of your next task. You are a cog in the vast, grinding machine of medieval society, sacrificing your own peace for the continuity of others' lineages, a weary architect of alliances in a world that never truly sleeps. And so, as the final flickering embers of our story softly fade, let your mind drift from the muddy roads and the grand halls of medieval Europe. The weight of dowries, the whispers of rumors, the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer, let them all gently recede. Picture yourself now, not as the weary matchmaker, but simply as you are comfortably nestled, safe and warm. The anxieties of lords and ladies, the harsh realities of a bygone era, are but echoes, hushed and distant. Feel the gentle pull of slumber, a soft current guiding you away from the complexities of history, towards the tranquility of deep, peaceful rest. The long journeys are over, the negotiations concluded, and the silent vigil against the night's uncertainties can finally cease. Just breathe, slowly and evenly, allowing every tension to melt away. Let the quiet settle around you, a blanket of calm, and surrender to the embrace of sleep.